At Denver International Airport on a busy Thursday morning, 78-year-old Marine veteran Robert Mitchell was pulled aside for what TSA agents called a routine additional screening. What happened next would spark a confrontation that brought one of America's busiest airports to a complete standstill and resulted in the immediate termination of multiple federal employees. The man who witnessed it all? Air Force General Patricia Hawkins, traveling in civilian clothes, who had been quietly observing from just 20 feet away. By the time she was finished, careers would be destroyed, protocols would be rewritten, and the entire TSA would face a congressional investigation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Mitchell had been making this same trip from Denver to Phoenix every 3 months for the past 5 years. His daughter Sarah lived there with her twin boys, and at 78, these visits had become the highlight of his carefully structured retirement routine. Robert moved slowly but deliberately through the airport, his worn leather wallet containing his military ID, his boarding pass, and a faded photograph of his late wife Margaret tucked safely in his shirt pocket. The morning had started like any other. Robert arrived at the airport 2 hours early, as was his habit, and made his way through the initial security checkpoint without incident. His prosthetic leg, a reminder of his service in Vietnam, triggered the metal detector as expected. He had been through this routine hundreds of times before. A polite explanation, a gentle pat-down, and he would be on his way. But today was different. TSA Agent Marcus Sullivan was having what his colleagues would later describe as one of those days. 3 weeks into the job, after transferring from Chicago O'Hare, Sullivan was eager to prove himself at his new assignment. His supervisor, Linda Torres, had been particularly critical of his attention to detail during his probationary period. The pressure was mounting, and Sullivan was determined not to let anything slip by on his watch. When Robert's prosthetic triggered the metal detector, Sullivan immediately called for additional screening. Standard procedure would have involved a brief explanation and a targeted pat-down of the affected area. Instead, Sullivan insisted on a full-body search, claiming that Robert's military ID looked suspicious and that his prosthetic could potentially conceal prohibited items. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," Sullivan announced, his voice carrying an authority that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Robert, ever respectful of authority despite his confusion, complied without protest. 20 feet away, Air Force General Patricia Hawkins was removing her laptop from its case at a nearby security lane. Dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, nothing about her appearance suggested her true identity. At 52, General Hawkins commanded the Air Force's Personnel Center and had spent the last 3 decades working her way up through the ranks. She had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, managed billion-dollar budgets, and earned the respect of military personnel across all branches of service. She was traveling to a classified briefing in San Antonio, maintaining a low profile, as was standard protocol for high-ranking military officials on domestic flights. But as she watched the elderly veteran being escorted to a private screening area, something in his demeanor, the way he carried himself despite his age, the careful way he folded his boarding pass, the quiet dignity with which he accepted what was clearly an unnecessary humiliation, caught her attention. Inside the private screening room, what should have been a brief encounter escalated rapidly. Sullivan, backed by his colleague Jennifer Walsh, insisted that Robert remove his prosthetic leg entirely for inspection. When Robert explained that this would be both physically difficult and medically inadvisable without proper support, Sullivan became increasingly aggressive. "Sir, if you don't comply with our security procedures, you will not be permitted to fly," Sullivan stated, his tone suggesting that Robert's reasonable concerns were somehow suspicious in themselves. "We have protocols to follow, and your military service doesn't give you special treatment." The comment about his military service struck Robert like a physical blow. In all his years of traveling through dozens of airports and hundreds of security checks, no TSA agent had ever suggested that his veteran status was somehow being used to circumvent security measures. He had never asked for special treatment, never demanded exceptions, never done anything but comply politely with every request. Robert's hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a deep sense of indignity that he struggled to articulate. At 78, having survived combat, the loss of his leg, the death of his beloved wife, and the challenges of aging, he found himself facing a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical wound he had endured. "I served this country for 22 years, Robert said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I lost this leg defending the freedoms you're supposed to be protecting. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic human dignity," Sullivan's response would later be described in the formal complaint as callous and unprofessional. He insisted that Robert's military service was irrelevant to current security procedures and that emotional appeals would not change TSA protocols. Walsh, rather than de-escalating the situation, supported her colleagues' increasingly harsh demands. Meanwhile, General Hawkins had finished her own security screening and was making her way toward her gate when she heard raised voices coming from the private screening area. The walls were thin, and Robert's quiet but firm voice carried clearly as he attempted to explain his situation. More troubling was the aggressive tone of the TSA agents, whose responses grew increasingly confrontational with each passing minute. General Hawkins had spent her career in situations where quick judgment calls could mean the difference between life and death, success and failure, honor and disgrace. She recognized the sound of authority being abused, of power being wielded without wisdom or compassion. Every instinct told her to intervene, but protocol demanded discretion. High-ranking military officers traveling in civilian clothes were expected to maintain their cover unless circumstances became truly extraordinary. As she stood outside the screening area, listening to an elderly veteran being systematically stripped of his dignity by federal employees who seemed to have forgotten the very principles they were sworn to protect, General Hawkins made a decision that would define not just the next few hours, but the trajectory of several careers and the future of TSA procedures nationwide. The circumstances had become extraordinary. General Hawkins positioned herself strategically near the entrance to the private screening area, close enough to monitor the situation while maintaining plausible deniability. Her training in intelligence operations had taught her the value of observation before action, and what she witnessed over the next 10 minutes would fuel her anger for months to come. Inside the screening room, Sullivan had escalated his demands beyond any reasonable interpretation of TSA guidelines. He now insisted that Robert undergo a complete strip search, claiming that his prosthetic leg, his military bearing, and what he called evasive behavior constituted multiple red flags, requiring maximum security protocols. Robert sat on a plastic chair, his prosthetic leg detached and placed on the inspection table like evidence in a criminal case. The indignity of his situation was compounded by the physical discomfort. Without his prosthetic properly secured, maintaining balance required considerable effort, and the strain was visible on his weathered face. "This is completely unnecessary," Robert said, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to command, but trying to remain respectful. "I've traveled this route dozens of times. My prosthetic has been cleared by TSA agents at airports across the country. There's nothing different about today except your approach to this situation." Walsh stepped forward with a handheld metal detector, running it over Robert's prosthetic with theatrical precision. The device remained silent, as it had during hundreds of similar searches at airports nationwide. But rather than concluding the search, Sullivan seized on what he claimed was suspicious behavior during the scanning process. "Sir, you appeared nervous when the wand approached the upper portion of your prosthetic," Sullivan announced. consulting a laminated card that outlined behavioral indicators. According to our training materials, this type of anxiety response can indicate attempts to conceal prohibited materials. The accusation was so absurd that Robert initially thought it must be some kind of misunderstanding. He had been nervous, certainly. Nervous about the unnecessary humiliation, nervous about missing his flight, nervous about the aggressive tone that had replaced what should have been a routine interaction. But the suggestion that his anxiety somehow proved criminal intent left him speechless. General Hawkins, listening from just outside the door, felt her jaw clench involuntarily. She had overseen security protocols at military installations around the world, had been briefed on terrorism prevention strategies by experts from every major intelligence agency, and had personally implemented screening procedures that protected some of America's most sensitive military assets. What she was witnessing bore no resemblance to professional security work. It was harassment disguised as procedure. Sullivan continued his performance, photographing Robert's prosthetic from multiple angles with a department-issued camera. Each flash seemed to diminish Robert's sense of dignity further. The elderly veteran sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, enduring what had become less of a security screening and more of a public humiliation. "I need to call my supervisor," Walsh announced suddenly, producing a radio. "We may need to involve airport police in this situation." The threat of police involvement seemed to energize Sullivan, who began speaking more loudly, as if performing for an audience. He recited TSA regulations with the enthusiasm of someone eager to demonstrate his authority, misinterpreting guidelines in ways that transformed routine procedures into instruments of intimidation. Robert's composure finally began to crack. Not from fear, he had faced far more frightening situations during his military career, but from the sheer absurdity of being treated like a criminal for the crime of traveling while elderly and disabled. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor that had nothing to do with age. "Young man, I was fighting for this country before you were born," Robert said quietly. "I've bled for the flag you wear on your uniform. I've buried friends who died protecting the freedoms you're supposed to be safeguarding. And right now, you're making a mockery of everything they sacrifice for." Sullivan's response revealed the depth of his inexperience and the poverty of his training. Rather than recognizing the weight of Robert's words, he seemed to interpret them as a challenge to his authority. His next statement would later be cited in congressional testimony as an example of everything wrong with TSA culture. "Your military service ended decades ago, sir. Today, in this airport, I'm the authority figure, and you'll follow my instructions or face the consequences. This is America in 2024, not whatever war you think you're still fighting." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The comment hit General Hawkins like a physical blow. She had heard similar sentiments from bureaucrats who had never worn a uniform, never taken an oath to defend the Constitution, never understood that military service was not a job that ended with retirement, but a commitment that lasted a lifetime. But hearing it directed at an elderly veteran who was being systematically stripped of his dignity crossed every line she had drawn in her mind. Outside the screening room, other passengers had begun to notice the commotion. A small crowd was gathering, drawn by the raised voices and the unusual length of what should have been a brief interaction. Some pulled out cell phones, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, though none yet understood the full scope of what was unfolding. Among the observers was Dr. Amanda Richardson, a trauma surgeon returning from a medical conference in Denver. Her trained eye immediately recognized signs of distress in the elderly man, visible through the partially open door. As a medical professional, she understood the physical and emotional toll that prolonged stress could have on someone of Robert's age. And what she witnessed alarmed her both professionally and personally. Also watching was Marcus Thompson, a journalist for the Denver Post who had been traveling to cover a story in Phoenix. Thompson's investigative instincts were triggered by the obvious disparity between the situation's severity and the TSA's response. He began taking careful notes, sensing that he was witnessing a story that extended far beyond a simple security screening. Inside the room, Sullivan had moved to what he announced was the final phase of the screening process. He informed Robert that a complete physical search would be necessary, requiring the removal of all clothing except underwear. The demand was so far outside standard TSA procedures that even Walsh seemed uncomfortable, though she remained silent rather than challenge her colleagues' increasingly erratic behavior. Robert looked up at Sullivan with an expression that combined disbelief, exhaustion, and a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just the current situation. In his eyes was the weight of a man who had given everything to his country and was now being treated as its enemy by its own servants. "Son," Robert said quietly, "I've been strip-searched by experts, by enemy soldiers who wanted information I wouldn't give them, by interrogators who knew how to break a man's spirit. But I never thought I'd be strip-searched by my own government in an airport in the country I spent my life defending." General Hawkins heard those words and felt something snap inside her chest. The time for observation was over. General Hawkins stepped into the screening room with the quiet confidence that comes from 3 decades of command experience. Her entrance was so natural, so seemingly casual, that Sullivan didn't immediately recognize the shift in dynamics that had just occurred. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to command attention without revealing her true identity. "I couldn't help but notice this screening has been going on for quite some time. Is everything all right?" Sullivan turned toward her with visible irritation. The last thing he needed was interference from a civilian passenger, especially when he was finally asserting his authority over what he had decided was a problematic traveler. His response revealed both his inexperience and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he had created. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area during active security screening procedures. You need to return to the main terminal immediately." Sullivan's tone carried the condescension of someone drunk on temporary power. "This passenger is undergoing enhanced screening due to multiple security concerns, and civilian observation is not permitted." General Hawkins took a step closer, her eyes moving from Sullivan to Robert, who was still sitting without his prosthetic leg, his dignity hanging by threads. She had seen wounded warriors in field hospitals, had visited veterans in VA facilities across the country, had delivered folded flags to widows at military funerals. But the sight of this elderly veteran being humiliated by his own government's employees triggered something primal in her leadership instincts. "What specific security concerns?" she asked, her question delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to getting complete answers. "And what TSA protocols authorize the level of screening you're currently conducting?" Walsh stepped forward, attempting to support her colleague while managing what she sensed was becoming a volatile situation. "Ma'am, we don't discuss ongoing security procedures with unauthorized personnel. If you don't leave immediately, we'll have to call airport security." The threat was meant to intimidate, but General Hawkins had faced down hostile foreign military commanders, congressional oversight committees, and Pentagon budget reviews. 2 TSA agents with delusions of authority barely registered on her threat assessment scale. "I'm not unauthorized personnel," she said quietly, reaching into her purse and producing her military identification. "I'm General Patricia Hawkins, United States Air Force, and I'm ordering you to explain exactly what justification you have for treating this veteran like a criminal." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sullivan's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, poorly concealed panic. Walsh actually took a step backward, her hand moving instinctively to her radio as if calling for backup could somehow undo what had just happened. Robert looked up at General Hawkins with an expression of profound relief mixed with amazement. In his decades of military service, He had learned to recognize real authority when he encountered it, and everything about this woman's bearing told him that his ordeal was about to end. "General, with all due respect," Sullivan began, his voice now carrying a tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "TSA operates under Department of Homeland Security authority, not military command structure. Our procedures are governed by federal aviation security regulations, not military protocols." It was technically correct, but strategically catastrophic. Sullivan had just informed a general officer that her authority meant nothing to him, while simultaneously continuing to humiliate an elderly veteran in her direct line of sight. General Hawkins smiled, not warmly, but with the cold precision of a predator that had just watched its prey make a fatal mistake. "You're absolutely right," she replied. "TSA does operate under DHS authority. Fortunately, I happen to be personally acquainted with Secretary Williams. We served together at the Pentagon for 3 years before his current appointment. I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about how his TSA agents are interpreting federal aviation security regulations." She paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. "I'm also curious to hear how you'll explain to your supervisor why you thought it was appropriate to strip search a 78-year-old disabled veteran based on what you've described as suspicious behavior during a routine prosthetic screening." The color drained from Sullivan's face as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. He had escalated a routine security screening into a confrontation with a general officer, created a public spectacle that was being witnessed by dozens of passengers, and documented his actions with photographs that would serve as evidence of his inappropriate conduct. Dr. Richardson, who had been monitoring the situation from outside, chose this moment to step forward. As a medical professional, she felt obligated to address what she recognized as a potentially dangerous situation for Robert's health. "General, I'm Dr. Amanda Richardson, trauma surgeon at Presbyterian Medical Center," she announced, producing her medical credentials. From a medical standpoint, this patient should not be subjected to prolonged physical stress. Extended separation from his prosthetic device could cause circulation problems, muscle strain, and increased fall risk. Her intervention added a new dimension to the crisis. Now, Sullivan wasn't just facing a military command authority and public embarrassment. He was confronting the possibility that his actions had created a medical emergency. The implications for his career, already dire, became potentially criminal if Robert suffered any physical harm during the screening process. Marcus Thompson, the journalist, had been furiously taking notes and discreetly recording audio on his phone. The story he had initially seen as a simple TSA overreach had evolved into something much larger, a confrontation between military authority and federal bureaucracy, played out in public with an elderly veteran as the unwitting centerpiece. "Agent Sullivan," General Hawkins said, her voice now carrying the full weight of command authority. "You have exactly 30 seconds to explain to me why this screening has exceeded all reasonable bounds, why proper supervisory approval wasn't obtained for enhanced procedures, and why you thought it was appropriate to treat a disabled veteran with such obvious disrespect." Sullivan's response revealed the depth of his panic and the poverty of his training. Instead of attempting to de-escalate or acknowledge his mistakes, he doubled down on his authority claims and made what would later be described as the single worst decision of his TSA career. "General, I understand your concern, but I cannot allow military pressure to compromise airport security protocols. This passenger has exhibited multiple behavioral indicators consistent with TSA threat assessment guidelines, and I will not be intimidated into abandoning proper screening procedures." Regardless of who is applying pressure, the silence that followed Sullivan's statement was profound. General Hawkins looked at him with an expression that officers under her command would have recognized as the calm before an absolutely devastating storm. Dr. Richardson shook her head in disbelief. Even Walsh seemed to realize that her colleague had just ended his career with a single paragraph. "Agent Sullivan," General Hawkins said, her voice now carrying the quiet intensity that preceded major military operations. "You just made your second critical error of the day. Your first was harassing an elderly veteran. Your second was suggesting that a general officer of the United States Air Force was attempting to compromise national security." She paused, letting the weight of his mistake settle over him like a blanket. "Your third error is about to be assuming that I don't have the authority to shut down this entire operation. General." Hawkins pulled out her cell phone with the deliberate precision of someone about to launch a coordinated military strike. The device in her hands wasn't just a phone. It was a direct line to the highest levels of federal authority, a tool that could mobilize resources across multiple government agencies within minutes. "Dr. Richardson," she said without taking her eyes off Sullivan, "please examine Mr. Mitchell immediately and document any physical distress or medical concerns resulting from this screening process. Your findings will be included in the formal complaint I'm about to file." She turned to Marcus Thompson, who was still taking notes near the doorway. "You're a journalist, correct? I'm going to ask you to serve as an independent witness to what happens next. This situation is about to escalate to levels that require media oversight." Sullivan watched this coordination with growing alarm. What had begun as a simple assertion of his TSA authority was transforming into something that would clearly extend far beyond the Denver airport. His radio crackled with routine security chatter, but he couldn't bring himself to call for backup, partly because he was no longer certain who would respond to his aid, and partly because he was beginning to understand that backup wouldn't help him now. General Hawkins dialed a number from memory. The call connected after 2 rings. "Secretary Williams, this is General Patricia Hawkins. I apologize for calling your direct line, but we have a situation at Denver International Airport that requires immediate intervention at the highest levels." Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of military briefings, conveying maximum information with minimum words, even from several feet away. Sullivan could hear the authoritative voice responding on the other end of the call. Secretary Williams, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, was clearly asking for details. "Sir, I'm witnessing the systematic harassment of a 78-year-old disabled Marine veteran by 2 TSA agents who have exceeded all reasonable screening protocols." General Hawkins continued. "The veteran has been separated from his prosthetic leg for over 45 minutes, subjected to unauthorized photography, threatened with strip searches, and verbally abused by agents who have refused supervisory oversight." She paused, listening to the secretary's response, then continued with devastating precision. "Agent Marcus Sullivan, badge number 7492, has specifically stated that military authority has no relevance to his actions and has accused me of attempting to compromise national security when I questioned his procedures. I am formally requesting immediate intervention and a complete investigation of this facility's adherence to federal screening guidelines." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with General Hawkins providing specific details, agent names, and a precise timeline of events. Sullivan could only watch as his career was methodically dismantled in real time by someone with direct access to his ultimate supervisor. Meanwhile, Dr. Richardson had knelt beside Robert's chair and was conducting a rapid medical assessment. Her findings were troubling, but not surprising. Elevated blood pressure, signs of dehydration, muscle tension from maintaining an awkward seated position without proper support, and visible stress indicators that could pose serious risks for someone his age. "General," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this patient is showing signs of medical distress directly attributable to the prolonged nature of this screening. In my professional opinion, continuing this process without immediate medical intervention could constitute a serious health risk." Her statement added a new legal dimension to Sullivan's problems. If Robert suffered any medical emergency while in TSA custody, Sullivan could face personal liability beyond simple employment termination. The enhanced screening he had insisted on was now officially documented as medically dangerous by a licensed physician. Walsh, who had remained largely silent during the escalation, finally found her voice. "General, perhaps we could resolve this situation without involving higher authorities. I think there may have been some miscommunication about proper procedures. It was too little, too late." General Hawkins had finished her call with Secretary Williams and was now dialing another number. This time, she was calling the Airport Operations Center directly. "This is General Patricia Hawkins, United States Air Force. I need to speak with the Airport Operations Manager immediately regarding a federal security incident requiring immediate management oversight." The response was swift. Within minutes, James Mitchell, Denver International's operations manager, arrived at the screening area with 2 airport police officers and a senior TSA supervisor named Captain Rodriguez, who had been hastily summoned. From his office across the terminal, Captain Rodriguez took one look at the scene: an elderly veteran sitting without his prosthetic leg, a general officer on the phone with federal authorities, a doctor providing medical assessment, and a journalist documenting everything, and immediately understood that he was looking at a career-ending catastrophe for his subordinates. "General Hawkins," he said, his voice carefully respectful, "I am Captain Rodriguez, TSA supervisor for this checkpoint. I sincerely apologize for any inappropriate procedures that may have occurred. If you could brief me on the situation, I'll ensure immediate corrective action." General Hawkins ended her second call and turned her full attention to Rodriguez. Her expression made clear that apologies would not be sufficient. "Captain, your agents have been conducting an unauthorized enhanced screening of a disabled veteran for nearly an hour. They have ignored medical concerns, exceeded standard operating procedures, refused supervisory consultation, and when questioned about their actions, accused a general officer of attempting to compromise national security." She gestured toward Robert, who was now being assisted by Dr. Richardson in reattaching his prosthetic leg. This man served his country with distinction, lost his leg in combat, and has been traveling through airports for decades without incident. Today, your agents decided to treat him like a terrorist. Suspect based on what they claim were behavioral indicators that exist only in their imagination. Rodriguez looked at Sullivan and Walsh with an expression that conveyed both professional disappointment and personal fury. He had spent 15 years building a reputation for running efficient, respectful security operations, and these 2 agents had destroyed months of positive community relations in a single morning. "Agent Sullivan," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that precedes mass terminations, "you will immediately return to the security office and remain there pending investigation. Agent Walsh, you will accompany him. Neither of you will have any further contact with passengers, media, or airport personnel until this matter is resolved." But General Hawkins wasn't finished. Her next words would ensure that this incident extended far beyond simple employment discipline. "Captain Rodriguez, I've just spoken with Secretary Williams and Airport Operations Manager Mitchell. As of this moment, I am formally invoking my authority as a general officer to request a complete operational review of this security checkpoint. No flights will depart from this concourse until federal investigators can review your procedures, interview your staff, and ensure that what happened here today cannot happen again." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. She wasn't just filing a complaint or requesting discipline for 2 agents. She was shutting down a significant portion of one of America's busiest airports during peak travel hours. Hundreds of flights, thousands of passengers, millions of dollars in airline revenue, all brought to a standstill because 2 TSA agents had forgotten that their job was to protect travelers. not terrorize them. Airport Operations Manager Mitchell stepped forward, understanding that he was now managing a crisis that would make national news within hours. General, while I absolutely support your concerns and will cooperate fully with any investigation, shutting down the concourse will affect thousands of passengers who had nothing to do with this incident. General Hawkins looked at Robert, who was now standing with Dr. Richardson's assistants, his dignity slowly returning as he regained his mobility. Then she looked back at Mitchell with the expression of someone who had made countless difficult decisions and was comfortable with the consequences. Mr. Mitchell, thousands of passengers will be inconvenienced today, but if we don't take decisive action now, how many more elderly veterans, disabled travelers, and innocent Americans will be subjected to this same treatment tomorrow? The airport fell silent around her words, and in that silence, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something larger than a simple security dispute. They were witnessing a moment when institutional authority was held accountable for institutional failure. Within 30 minutes of General Hawkins' calls, Denver International Airport transformed into a coordinated response center that resembled a military operation more than a commercial travel hub. Federal investigators from the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General arrived via government aircraft, their black SUVs creating a convoy that caught the attention of every news outlet in the Denver metropolitan area. Robert Mitchell found himself at the center of a media storm he never could have imagined. Seated in the airport's VIP lounge, with Dr. Richardson monitoring his condition and General Hawkins coordinating the federal response, he watched through floor-to-ceiling windows as news vans surrounded the terminal building. The story had broken nationally within 2 hours, with cable news networks leading their coverage with headlines about an Air Force general shutting down a major airport to protect a veteran's dignity. Marcus Thompson had transmitted his story to the Denver Post's digital platform before the airport shutdown was complete. His eyewitness account, combined with audio recordings he had captured on his phone, provided news organizations with the detailed timeline that would drive coverage for the following weeks. By evening, Thompson would receive calls from book publishers, documentary filmmakers, and congressional staffers requesting additional information about what was already being called the Denver airport incident. The operational shutdown affected 127 flights and approximately 18,000 passengers. Airlines scrambled to reroute aircraft, while airport personnel worked to manage the crowds of stranded travelers. But rather than the anger and frustration that typically accompanies travel delays, something unexpected happened. As word spread about why the airport had been shut down, passengers began organizing their own show of support for Robert. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, traveling in uniform to her new assignment at Peterson Air Force Base, approached Robert's location and requested permission to speak with him. She was followed by dozens of other military personnel who happened to be traveling through Denver that day. Within an hour, Robert found himself surrounded by service members from all branches of the military, creating an impromptu honor guard that drew respectful attention from civilian passengers throughout the terminal. The federal investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Inspector General Margaret Foster had arrived with a team of 12 investigators who immediately began documenting the screening area, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing security footage. The evidence against Sullivan and Walsh was overwhelming. Surveillance cameras had captured every moment of their interaction with Robert, providing visual confirmation of every allegation in General Hawkins's formal complaint. Sullivan and Walsh were escorted from the premises by federal marshals within 3 hours of the incident's conclusion. Their employment with TSA was terminated immediately, and both faced potential federal charges for violation of civil rights under color of authority. The photographs Sullivan had taken of Robert's prosthetic leg, originally intended as evidence of his thoroughness, became evidence of his complete disregard for proper procedures and basic human dignity. Captain Rodriguez faced his own professional reckoning. While not directly involved in the harassment, his failure to properly train and supervise his agents made him complicit in their actions. He was reassigned to a desk position pending a complete review of his management practices, effectively ending his operational career with TSA. The broader implications extended far beyond individual punishments. Secretary Williams announced a comprehensive review of TSA screening procedures for disabled travelers, with particular emphasis on protocols involving prosthetic devices and medical equipment. The review would be conducted jointly by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and disability rights organizations. General Hawkins, meanwhile, found herself thrust into an unexpected role as a national advocate for traveler dignity and veterans' rights. Her decisive action at Denver had captured public attention in ways that traditional military leadership rarely achieved. Within weeks, she would be invited to testify before Congress about TSA procedures and the treatment of disabled travelers in federal facilities. Robert's story became a catalyst for legislative action. Representative David Martinez of Colorado introduced the Traveler Dignity Act within a month of the incident, proposing strict limitations on enhanced screening procedures for elderly and disabled passengers. The bill gained bipartisan support, with veterans organizations and disability rights groups providing testimony about systemic problems within federal security agencies. Dr. Richardson's medical documentation proved crucial in establishing the broader health implications of prolonged security screenings. Her detailed report on Robert's physical and emotional distress during the incident became the foundation for new medical guidelines governing the treatment of elderly passengers during security procedures. Medical professionals across the country cited her intervention as an example of the responsibility healthcare providers have to advocate for patient welfare even outside traditional medical settings. The media coverage extended far beyond the initial incident. Investigative journalists discovered that Denver International was not an isolated case. Similar incidents had occurred at airports nationwide, but most had been resolved quietly through internal TSA procedures that protected agents from accountability while providing minimal compensation to affected travelers. Robert's case became emblematic of a systemic problem that had been hidden from public scrutiny for years. 6 months later, Robert received a formal apology from Secretary Williams, accompanied by a comprehensive policy reform package that redesigned TSA procedures for disabled travelers. The apology was delivered personally at a ceremony honoring his military service, attended by General Hawkins, Dr. Richardson, and representatives from veterans organizations across the country. The personal relationships forged during the crisis continued long after the media attention faded. General Hawkins and Robert developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared military experience. She visited him regularly during her trips through Denver, and he attended her retirement ceremony 2 years later, where he was recognized as an honored guest. Dr. Richardson became an advocate for elderly traveler rights, working with medical organizations to develop guidelines for healthcare providers who witness inappropriate treatment of patients in public settings. Her intervention during Robert's ordeal became a case study in medical schools across the country, illustrating the responsibility physicians have to protect vulnerable populations regardless of the setting. Marcus Thompson's coverage of the incident earned him a Pulitzer Prize nomination and led to a book deal for a comprehensive examination of post-9/11 security culture in America. His work documented dozens of similar cases that had never received public attention, contributing to a national conversation about balancing security needs with individual dignity. The broader institutional changes proved lasting and significant. TSA implemented mandatory sensitivity training for all agents, established ombudsman offices at major airports to handle traveler complaints, and created specific protocols for screening elderly and disabled passengers that emphasized dignity, preservation, alongside security effectiveness. Robert returned to his regular travel schedule within months of the incident, but his experience had been fundamentally altered. Airport security agents at locations across the country now recognized him from the media coverage, and his screenings became models of respectful efficiency. More importantly, he received hundreds of letters from veterans and disabled travelers who shared their own stories of mistreatment, and he became an unofficial advocate for traveler rights within the veteran community. The Denver airport incident became a landmark case in civil rights law, cited in legal briefs and academic papers, examining the balance between security authority and individual dignity. Law schools used the case to teach students about the importance of institutional accountability and the role of individual courage in challenging systemic abuse. Years later, when asked about the day that changed everything, Robert would reflect on the unexpected alliance that formed between a Marine veteran, an Air Force general, a trauma surgeon, and a journalist, strangers brought together by circumstances that revealed the best and worst of American institutions. The small plastic chair where Robert had sat during his ordeal was eventually replaced, but the screening room remained as a reminder to TSA agents of the day when institutional authority was held accountable for institutional failure. The incident proved that even the most powerful bureaucracies could be reformed when individuals with courage and authority decided that human dignity was worth fighting for. In the end, the story that began with one elderly veteran's humiliation became a testament to the power of principled leadership and the possibility of institutional change when good people refuse to accept unacceptable behavior, regardless of who is perpetrating it or what authority they claim to possess. 5 years after the Denver airport incident, the ripple effects continued to reshape American travel security in ways that no one could have predicted. What began as a single confrontation between TSA agents and an elderly veteran had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how federal agencies approach citizen interaction and accountability. The Robert Mitchell Traveler Protection Center opened at Denver International Airport on the 5th anniversary of the incident. The facility, funded through a combination of federal appropriations and private donations, served as both a resource center for travelers with disabilities and a training facility for security personnel. General Hawkins, now retired, served as the center's first director, bringing military precision to civilian traveler advocacy. The center's main conference room featured a bronze plaque commemorating the incident, but more importantly, it housed a sophisticated simulation facility where TSA agents from across the country came to practice de-escalation techniques and sensitivity protocols. The training scenarios, developed in consultation with disability rights organizations and veterans groups, ensured that future agents would understand the human impact of their authority. Sullivan and Walsh had both pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations 18 months after the incident. Sullivan received a suspended sentence and community service requirements that included volunteering at veterans' facilities, while Walsh, who had shown genuine remorse and cooperated fully with investigators, received probation and mandatory sensitivity training. Neither would ever work in federal security again, but their cases became cautionary tales used in training programs nationwide. Dr. Richardson had leveraged her experience into a new career focus, establishing the Medical Advocacy and Public Spaces Foundation. The organization trained healthcare professionals to recognize and intervene in situations where vulnerable populations faced mistreatment in government facilities, airports, and other public venues. Her protocols had been adopted by medical schools in 43 states, creating a new generation of physicians equipped to advocate for patients beyond traditional medical settings. Marcus Thompson's book, The Dignity Test, how one airport confrontation changed American security had spent 16 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. More significantly, it had sparked a national conversation about the balance between security and civil liberties that influenced policy discussions in Congress, state legislatures, and city councils across the country. Thompson continued covering civil rights issues for the Denver Post, but his reputation from the airport incident had made him a sought-after expert on government accountability. The legislative impact proved more substantial than anyone had anticipated. The Traveler Dignity Act had passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing federal standards for the treatment of elderly and disabled travelers. The law required mandatory training, created independent oversight mechanisms, and established clear penalties for agents who exceeded their authority. 26 states had passed additional legislation expanding protections for vulnerable travelers within their jurisdictions. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than legal. The phrase, "Remember Denver," had become shorthand within federal agencies for the importance of treating citizens with respect regardless of circumstances. Training programs across the Department of Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration, and other federal agencies used the incident as a case study in how quickly institutional authority could be undermined by individual misconduct. Robert himself had become an unlikely public figure, though he consistently deflected attention from his personal experience to focus on broader issues affecting veterans and disabled travelers. At 83, he continued his regular travels to visit his daughter, but now these trips included speaking engagements at airports, veterans facilities, and disability rights conferences. His calm demeanor and clear articulation of the principles at stake had made him an effective advocate for traveler dignity. The relationship between Robert and General Hawkins had evolved into a partnership that extended far beyond their initial encounter. They co-authored articles for military publications about leadership accountability, appeared together at congressional hearings on veterans issues, and collaborated on training programs for military personnel transitioning to civilian security roles. Their friendship demonstrated how shared principles could bridge differences in rank, service branch, and generational experience. International attention had also followed the incident. European Union transportation officials had implemented similar protections for disabled travelers, citing the Denver case as evidence of the need for comprehensive reform. Airport security agencies in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom had sent delegations to study the training programs developed in response to the incident, leading to policy changes that improved traveler treatment across multiple countries. The academic impact proved equally significant. Business schools used the case to teach crisis management and institutional accountability, while law schools examined it as an example of how individual actions could drive systemic reform. Public administration programs analyzed the incident as a demonstration of how government agencies could respond constructively to legitimate criticism rather than defensively protecting flawed practices. Captain Rodriguez had eventually found redemption through comprehensive retraining and a new assignment developing TSA sensitivity protocols. His experience supervising agents who had lost sight of their mission led him to become one of the agency's most effective advocates for respectful passenger treatment. His transformation from part of the problem to part of the solution illustrated the possibility of institutional learning and personal growth. The Denver Airport Incident Memorial Garden, located outside the terminal's main entrance, provided a quiet space for reflection on the principles of dignity, respect, and accountability. The garden featured plants native to Colorado, benches designed for accessibility, and informational plaques describing the incident's impact on traveler rights. It served as a reminder that individual courage could challenge institutional failure and create lasting positive change. Technology had also evolved in response to the incident. New screening equipment designed specifically for prosthetic devices had been deployed at airports nationwide, reducing the need for manual inspections and preserving traveler dignity. The devices, developed through collaboration between TSA engineers and disability advocacy groups, represented a practical solution that enhanced both security effectiveness and passenger comfort. The annual Robert Mitchell Dignity and Travel Award, established by the American Association of Airport Executives, recognized TSA agents, airport personnel, and other transportation security professionals who demonstrated exceptional commitment to treating travelers with respect. Winners received recognition at national conferences and additional training opportunities, creating positive incentives for excellent passenger service. Educational institutions had integrated the incident into curricula across multiple disciplines. Criminal justice programs examined it as a case study in appropriate use of authority, while social work schools used it to teach advocacy techniques. Psychology departments analyzed the group dynamics that had allowed the harassment to escalate and the intervention strategies that had ended it effectively. The most powerful legacy of the Denver airport incident was the cultural shift it represented within federal agencies. New employees learned about the case during orientation, understanding from their first day that their authority came with responsibilities to treat citizens with dignity. Supervisors used the incident to reinforce expectations for professional conduct, while agency leadership cited it as an example of how individual actions could affect institutional reputation. As Robert boarded his flight to Phoenix on the 5th anniversary of the incident, he reflected on how much had changed. The TSA agents who screened him were professional, efficient, and respectful. The process took less than 5 minutes, and his prosthetic leg was inspected using new technology that eliminated the need for removal or extended manual examination. But more than the procedural improvements, Robert noticed a fundamental change in attitude. Security personnel treated travelers as citizens to be protected rather than suspects to be processed. The cultural transformation that had begun with one general's refusal to tolerate institutional abuse had created ripple effects that would protect countless future travelers from similar mistreatment. The Denver airport incident proved that even the most entrenched bureaucratic practices could be reformed when individuals with courage and authority decided that human dignity was worth defending. It demonstrated that accountability was possible within government institutions, that individual actions could drive systemic change, and that the principles of respect and dignity could prevail over the temptations of unchecked authority. In the end, what started as an elderly veteran's nightmare became America's reminder that institutional power must always be balanced by institutional accountability, and that sometimes the most important battles for freedom are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in the everyday spaces where citizens interact with their own government. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.